I remember my first truly serious commission. It was a heavy dining table made of solid white oak, the kind of wood that fights you back if your tools aren't razor sharp. I'd spent 3 grueling weeks fitting the mortise and tenon joints by hand, driving the pegs home with that perfect, tight thwack that tells you a joint will last a century. I had hand-planed the top until it had that silky, chatoyant luster that only old-growth timber gives you, finishing it with a simple oil that let the grain breathe. But when my apprentice and I finally hauled that beast into the client's house and set it down on their hardwood floor, it rocked. That sharp, mocking tuk-tuk sound. It's the sound every furniture maker hears in his nightmares. It's a sound that tells you all your precision, all your hours of measuring with a Starrett square, might have been for nothing. My first reaction, like anyone who trusts a precision instrument more than the raw logic of the space they're standing in, was to reach for the saw. I was convinced I'd mismeasured a shoulder, or that one leg had shifted during the glue-up. I decided to just trim one leg by a hair, then the next. I was chasing a ghost of a level. 40 minutes later, I was standing in a thick cloud of oak dust over a table that was now nearly 2 inches shorter than it was supposed to be, but it was still wobbling just as irritably. The only difference was that now it was rocking on the opposite diagonal. It is a classic trap. We are conditioned to think that if a table rocks, the object itself is broken. We assume one leg is longer than the others and must be shortened. We grab the rasp, the chisel, or the sandpaper, turning what should be a moment of professional pride into a frantic, chaotic chase for balance. But the truth is, the table isn't broken. It's just facing the wrong way. Have you ever stopped to wonder why a 3-legged stool in an old milking barn never wobbles? You can toss it onto a floor of broken cobblestones, onto frozen mud, or onto a warped attic floor, and it will sit dead still every single time. It might be tilted, but it won't rock. The masters of the past, the men who built barns that have stood for 300 years, knew a secret that is currently buried under tons of plastic shims, adjustable screw-on feet, and those cheap felt leveling kits they push at every big box hardware store. There is a mathematical proof here. It isn't a trick, a hack, or a craftsman's superstition. It is a fundamental law of geometry that states any 4-legged table, provided the legs are roughly equal, can be stabilized on any continuous uneven floor simply by rotating it around its center. No tools, no sawdust, no shims. Just 15 seconds of your time. This knowledge was once basic for those who built entire timber frame houses without a single nail. And it still works flawlessly today if you can just step out of the sawdust for a moment and understand the nature of the surface you're standing on. To understand why your table is talking back to you, we have to look back at Euclid of Alexandria. Around 300 BC, he laid down the axioms that define the rules of construction for the next 2 millennia. Among them was a principle so elementary we've forgotten it. 3 points define a plane. If you take any 3 points in space that aren't in a straight line, exactly 1 flat surface will pass through them. Not 2, not about 1, but strictly 1. This is why the 3-legged stool is the king of the barn. It doesn't care if its legs are different lengths or if the floor looks like the frozen waves of the Atlantic. Geometry makes wobbling physically impossible for 3 legs. The problem we struggle with in our modern workshops begins with that 4th point. 4 points aren't obligated to lie in the same plane. If 3 legs touch the floor and the 4th is off by even half a millimeter, the table starts to rock. Modern instinct says to fix the object, cut it, glue it, adjust it. But the old masters looked at it differently. They realized the problem wasn't in the leg, but in the orientation of the object in space. The table isn't broken, it's just not seated yet. I didn't fully grasp this until I began studying the Shaker communities of the 19th century. They built furniture with fixed, uncompromising legs, yet their pieces stood rock solid on hand-hewn pine floors that warped with every change in the New England humidity. They didn't achieve that through endless trimming. They worked with the concept of a continuous surface. They understood that the floor and the table are part of the same machine. I remember standing in a quiet community house in New Lebanon, New York, a few years back. The floor was made of massive white pine planks, some of them 18 inches wide, harvested before the Civil War. These weren't the flat, engineered surfaces we're used to in modern suburban homes. Over a century and a half, those planks had cupped and bowed, responding to the humid summers of the Hudson Valley and the bone-dry winters of the Northeast. They looked like a gentle, rolling sea frozen in wood. On that floor sat a trestle table, nearly 10 feet long, built by hands that had been in the grave for 100 years. I walked up to it, fully expecting it to rattle when I leaned my weight on the corner. It didn't move a fraction of an inch. It felt like it was rooted into the earth itself. The shakers weren't trying to be artists. They were engineers of utility. They worked in an era where a level was a heavy, temperamental tool made of cherry wood and a glass vial of alcohol, and it was rarely used to check a floor. They understood that a house is a living thing. It breathes, it settles, it shifts. If you build a table with the rigid, arrogant assumption that the floor will always be a perfect geometric plane, you are building a failure. Their solution wasn't to add complexity, but to lean into the physics of the material. They built furniture that was stout enough to hold its shape, but they understood that the final fitting of a piece of furniture didn't happen in the workshop. It happened in the room where it lived. Across the ocean, in the traditional workshops of Kyoto, the Japanese masters faced an even more chaotic surface. For centuries, the center of the Japanese home was defined by tatami, mats made of woven, soft rush grass over a core of packed rice straw. A tatami floor is essentially a structured cushion. It has micro hills and valleys, and it compresses differently under every leg. If you've ever seen a traditional low dining table, or chabudai, you'll notice they often have slightly splayed legs and a very specific weight distribution. A Japanese carpenter didn't fight the floor. He didn't carry a bag of shims to a client's house. He knew that the stability of the table was a relationship, a conversation between the wood and the woven grass. He knew that if the table wobbled, he didn't need a saw. He needed to find the pocket where the floor invited the table to sit. This is the central philosophy we've lost. Stability is not a property of the object. It is a state of equilibrium between the object and the ground. In our modern industrial world, we've been sold the lie that if we buy a table from a factory that uses 5-axis CNC routers to cut legs to within 1/1000th of an inch, that table is perfect. But that perfection is a vacuum. The moment you take that perfect object and place it on a real-world floor, whether it's a concrete garage, a tiled kitchen, or a warped hardwood deck, that industrial precision becomes a liability. We've traded the wisdom of the masters for the convenience of the shim. We spend billions of dollars every year on adjustable plastic feet and felt pads because we've forgotten how to look at a floor. We treat the symptoms of a wobbly table instead of understanding the geometry of the problem. We've been conditioned to think that a wobbling table is a sign of poor craftsmanship, when in reality, it's often just a sign that we haven't finished the installation. To get back to that rock-solid feeling I felt in that New Lebanon meeting house, we have to stop acting like mechanics and start acting like practitioners of the surface. We have to understand that the solution isn't in our toolbox. It's in the way we perceive the space under our feet. When I finally walked away from that first ruined oak table, I realized that my obsession with the tape measure was actually a form of blindness. In the 20 years since, I've learned that the most precise tool in the shop isn't my dial caliper. It's my ability to read the relationship between an object and the earth. If you want to stop chasing wobbles and start mastering your environment, you have to look at these 5 specific techniques. They range from pure geometry to modern chemistry, but they all share one thing. They respect the material. Technique 1. The axial rotation, the 15-second theorem. This is the method I mentioned earlier, the one confirmed by physicist Andre Martin in 2005. It's based on the intermediate value theorem. I call it the point of repose. Mathematically, if your floor is continuous, meaning there are no sudden 3-inch steps or holes, you are guaranteed to find a stable orientation by rotating the table no more than 90 degrees. Here is how I execute this in my shop. I place the table in its intended spot and identify the talking diagonal. One leg is hovering and the table rocks back and forth. Instead of looking for a shim, I place my hands firmly on the center of the tabletop. I apply just enough downward pressure to keep the table in contact with the floor, and I begin to rotate it slowly, like I'm turning a massive dial. I move it 5 degrees, then 10. In my experience, the sweet spot usually reveals itself between 15 and 30 degrees. You will feel it before you see it. There is a specific physical sensation, a sudden increase in the perceived weight of the table. The tuk-tuk sound vanishes, replaced by a solid, monolithic thud when you wrap the surface. I've done this on old, cupped barn floors where the planks look like a washboard. It feels like magic, but it's just the 4 points of the legs finally finding a local plane that fits their specific geometry. The beauty of this is that it's non-destructive. You aren't cutting fibers. You aren't adding plastic trash. You are simply aligning the object with the reality of the room. Most people fail here because they give up after 5 degrees, or they try to lift the table while moving it. You have to keep the legs in contact with the floor so you can feel the moment the gap leg drops into its pocket. Technique 2. Epoxy casting, the custom prosthetic. Sometimes the table has to stay exactly where it is. Maybe it's aligned with a wall or centered under a chandelier. If rotation isn't an option, I use what I call epoxy casting. This is for the master who wants a museum-grade result that lasts a lifetime. I don't use liquid epoxy. I use a 2-part epoxy putty stick, the kind that looks like a giant crayon with a different colored core. I cut off a piece about the size of a large marble and knead it until the color is uniform. This tells me the chemical reaction has started. Now here is the professional detail. I don't just stick it on. I take a piece of 80 grit sandpaper and scuff the end grain of the short leg. I want to create mechanical teeth for the epoxy to grab onto. I press the putty onto the center of the leg's foot, forming a small dome. Then I lay a small square of 2mm plastic wrap on the floor exactly where that leg will sit. I lower the table carefully into position. The weight of the table, which might be 150 pounds of solid oak, crushes that putty until it perfectly fills the void between the wood and the floor. It creates a mirror image of the floor's topography. After 20 minutes, the putty is as hard as a rock. I flip the table over, trim the squeeze out with a sharp chisel, and sand the edges flush. If I'm working with walnut or dark oak, I'll mix a drop of burnt umber pigment into the putty or simply hit the dried edge with a furniture touch-up marker. The result is a table that sits with zero play. Unlike felt pads, epoxy doesn't compress over time. Unlike wood shims, it won't rot or slide out. It costs about $2 and provides a level of rigidity that an adjustable screw leg could never dream of. Technique 3. The back bevel block plane, the New England method. I learned this from an old restorer in Maine who spent his life fixing 18th century highboys. He never touched a saw for leveling. He used a low-angle block plane sharpened to a 25-degree bevel. This is counterintuitive, so listen closely. If the table rocks on a diagonal, you don't touch the short leg. You remove material from the 2 long legs that the table is currently pivoting on. The problem with a saw is that its error margin is the thickness of the blade, the kerf. That's usually about 1/16th of an inch, which is often more than the wobble itself. A block plane, set for a fine cut, removes material in microns. I can take a shaving that you can literally see through. I identify the pivot axis, the two legs that are staying on the floor while the others rock. I flip the table and take exactly 2 passes on the end grain of both long legs. I work from the outside in to avoid splintering the edges, what we call spelching. Then I stand it up and check. Usually it takes 3 or 4 iterations. The physical experience of this is pure craftsmanship. The sound of a sharp plane slicing through the end grain fibers of maple or oak is like a crisp shh. You aren't hacking at the wood, you are tuning it. By the time you're done, the bottoms of the legs are polished smooth, which actually helps prevent moisture from wicking up into the grain from the floor. You've solved the wobble without losing any noticeable height. Technique 4. The directional tapered wedge. When I'm dealing with heavy timber framework, like my 400-pound Rubo workbench, lifting it to apply epoxy is out of the question. For these beasts, I use the directional wedge, but I'm not talking about a scrap of 2x4. I'm talking about a precision-milled wedge made of the same species as the furniture. The key is the angle. Most people make wedges too steep, maybe 15 or 20 degrees. Under a heavy load, a steep wedge acts like a spring. It wants to squirt out the back. My wedges are never more than 3 to 5 degrees. This creates massive friction. I mill the wedge so it's about 4 inches long and tapers from 1/4 inch down to a feathered edge. Before I drive it in, I apply a thin layer of hide glue to the top of the wedge, the side touching the leg, and I rub the bottom, the side touching the floor, with a bit of beeswax or paraffin. I tap it in with a dead blow mallet until the wobble disappears, not a hair further. After the glue sets overnight, the wedge is essentially part of the leg. I take a flush-cut saw or a sharp chisel and trim the excess. Because the angle is so shallow and the material matches, the repair becomes invisible. It doesn't look like a fix. It looks like the leg just grew into the floor. Technique 5. The carbon trace scribe. This is the most advanced manual technique I know. It's how you fit a leg to a floor that is truly chaotic, like a fieldstone hearth or a rough-hewn log cabin floor. I use a piece of cardstock and a 6B soft graphite pencil. I heavily shade the cardstock until it's a solid, shimmering black, basically making my own carbon paper. I slide this paper, graphite side up, under the leg that's causing the trouble. I lean my weight on the table and give it a tiny 3-degree twist. When I lift the table, the graphite has transferred onto the bottom of the wood. But it hasn't transferred evenly. It only leaves marks on the high spots of the wood that were actually making contact. I take a small, curved gouge or a rasp and remove only the black marks. I repeat the process 3 times. Each time the black mark gets larger as more of the wood's surface begins to mate with the floor's profile. By the 3rd time, the entire foot is covered in graphite. When you set that table down, it doesn't just stop wobbling, it locks in. It feels like it was cast into a mold of the floor. There is no modern adjustable foot that can provide that level of surface contact. Modern industry wants you to believe that a table is a static box. They want you to buy a solution that sits between the wood and the world. But when you use these techniques, you realize that the wood is perfectly capable of meeting the world on its own terms. You aren't just a consumer of furniture anymore. You're a practitioner of balance. You've moved beyond the tuk-tuk and into the realm of the solid, silent foundation that characterizes true mastery. Over the 2 decades I've spent covered in sawdust, I've realized that the greatest obstacle to good work isn't a dull chisel. It's the way we've been taught to think. I spent years falling into the same traps I see apprentices fall into today. We carry these mental ghosts into the workshop, and they haunt our results. I've broken them down into 4 distinct patterns of error that once kept me from seeing the simple geometric truth of a wobbling table. The first is what I call the dictatorship of the tape measure. We are conditioned to believe that if my stare at square or my digital calipers say 4 legs are identical to the thousandth of an inch, the table must be stable. This is factory floor logic. It treats the table as an isolated object in a vacuum, ignoring the fact that it exists only in relation to a floor that is constantly shifting. A master doesn't measure for equality, he measures for fit. The second is the power move. When a joint feels loose or a table rocks, the modern instinct is to force it into submission. Drive in a bigger screw, add a steel L bracket, or slather it in more glue. I used to think I was making it stronger. In reality, I was just building a tension bomb. Wood is a biological material. It needs to move. A rigid metal fix on a moving organic structure eventually causes the fibers to tear themselves apart. The third is seasonal blindness. I've seen men spend hours leveling a table in a climate-controlled shop in January, only to have the client call in July because the table suddenly broke. It didn't break. The humidity went from 20% to 60%, and those wide oak boards expanded, subtly shifting the geometry of the base. If you don't build for the breath of the seasons, you're building a temporary object. Finally, there's the aisle 7 addiction. We've been trained to think that every problem has a solution in a plastic blister pack at the hardware store. We reach for the adjustable plastic feet or the rubber shims because it's easier than thinking about geometry. But every time you buy a fix, you're outsourcing your understanding of the craft. This shift in our thinking wasn't accidental. Before the 1980s, the furniture accessory market barely existed. If a local craftsman built you a table, he brought it to your house and set it in place. If it rocked, he fixed it right there with a rotation or a single pass of a plane. But then came the era of flat pack furniture, the Swedish model. Manufacturers needed a way to ship millions of identical boxes. They couldn't see your floor, so they standardized the object and forced you to deal with the reality of the room. This created a problem, and problems create markets. By 2010, the industry for felt pads, levelers, and dampers became a $4 billion annual business in the US alone. This entire economic machine depends on you not knowing about the 15-second rotation or the intermediate value theorem. You can't patent a law of geometry and put it on a shelf for $8.99. Now, as I promised at the start, I want to give you a specific bonus technique, a refinement of the graphite method I mentioned earlier. I call it the high point mapping. This is for when you want a piece to feel like it has literally grown out of the floor. Instead of just shading a piece of paper, take a 4B or 6B soft graphite stick and apply it directly to the bottom of the gap leg. Now place a piece of blue painter's tape on the floor exactly where the leg sits. Set the table down and without lifting it, give it a tiny, sharp pulse of weight. When you lift the table, the graphite on the tape won't be a solid block. It will be a map of the highest peaks of the floor's grain or the tile's texture. Instead of sanding the whole foot, take a sharp 1/2-inch chisel and just nick the areas on the wood that correspond to those high point marks. You are creating a micro relief. By removing just a few shavings in the exact right spots, you create a mated surface. I've used this on uneven slate floors where no amount of rotation would work, and the result is a table that feels like it's bolted to the bedrock. You won't find this in a modern design manual. It's a secret passed from hand to hand because it requires patience, not a credit card. Every time you stabilize a table with a simple 20-degree turn or a graphite map, you are committing a small act of independence. It's a triumph of logic over marketing. We live in a world that wants to sell you stability, but true stability is something you earn through understanding the material and the space it occupies. If you value this approach, not just making things, but understanding how they live in the world, I've put together over 100 of these techniques in my book, The Forgotten Workshop. Across its 171 pages, I've documented the skills that our grandfathers took for granted, from the secrets of hand-cut joints to historical finishes made from natural resins. These are the skills the industry would rather you forget. You can find it at the link in the description or by scanning the QR code on your screen now. Join the heritage of the joiner, hit that bell icon, and stay tuned. Every view and every share helps us keep this knowledge alive, ensuring it doesn't fade into the silence of the past. Until next time, get back into the shop, stop measuring for a second, and start feeling the grain. I'll see you at the bench.